Roberta Wolff, welcome to the Singing Teachers Talk podcast. How are things with you?
Very well, thank you, Alexa. It's lovely to be here with you, and thanks for having me.
We're together today to talk about creating optimal learning environments for children and young adults. So just to help us set this up a little bit, can you help us to contextualise what's kind of physically happening in the learning process and therefore why it's important for us to be considering the environment that we create?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, actually. Thank you. So what's happening in the learning process is massive, actually. There's all sorts of issues that we can be talking about, but perhaps just let's look at it through the lens of transformation. We just want to create a change, don't we? We want it to be some sort of change in our students' knowledge, but it can also be a change in their sense of self or how they feel about themselves. And I think that idea of transformation is what draws so many of us into teaching. In all of my work, I've never met a teacher that doesn't bring anything but positive intentions to their work. And yet some teaching engagements aren't as successful as others. So the environment is this sort of ecosystem that we can use and curate to align with our values and our goals and what we want the students to learn. So I find it quite a sort of rich way to think about bringing our intentions and our aims across to the student's experience, but also giving space for the student's voice, for them to learn and direct and have some autonomy in the process.
Can we consider the working memory at this point? So this is a system where a limited amount of information is held temporarily. I'm thinking of this in relation to our education system, and particularly the peripatetic teachers who are going into schools and working with students who are either already in a class and having to come out or in the middle of the day. And these students are also moving between their subjects relatively quickly. So what are the chances that all of the information that they're learning in the day, plus the stuff that we're putting onto them in our music classes, is going to make it over to that long-term memory? And what's going to have to happen for that to take place?
Yeah. I actually used to be a peripatetic teacher, so I have a lot of empathy for those struggles and, shortened lesson times and students arriving with all sorts of other things going on in their heads. I think, we need to be clear on where our influence lies. So we're going to struggle to make sort of structural changes, but we can influence the space that the learner comes into. And it sometimes requires a little bit more time to help them transition into the lesson so that they're ready to learn and engage with the process. But if we can find a way to give that time, then the learning will often be more successful. I think it's also how we get them to engage in the lesson. So for me, part of the learning environment is to create space for the student's voice, for them to feel comfortable to ask questions and to challenge us. I love it when students challenge me because it shows me that they're really, really thinking, and to sort of structure the learning so it's not just about this transmission model, but that the student is going through some sort of reflective thinking, critical thinking, being given opportunities to analyze their own work. So, instead of just immediately saying, well, this is what I think you did well, and this is what I think you need to improve, and this is how you're going to improve it, actually saying to them, how did that feel to you? How did it compare to when you practiced at home? And what do you want to do with this in the lesson today? And if we give these opportunities, actually the ideas are coming from the student themselves, and so they're going to be more likely to remember the lesson. And in fact, more motivated to follow through on the practice because you're meeting them exactly where they're at. And I also think it sets them up for better self-directed practice away from the lesson. And lots of, I think also lots of opportunities for them to summarize within the lesson. Where, for example, I don't write practice notes for my students. I get them to write their own notes in their own handwriting, in their own words, because then they'll understand them better. And again, is that little bit extra autonomy, ownership, this is my space also.
Reflecting on your own education or during CPD as the learner, what instance stands out to you as being particularly successful for your own learning?
I really, really love this question, actually. And for me, I work best from a strengths-based approach. I do not respond well to a sort of deficit model. And it's transformative, for the person that's teaching me to already have a vision of what I might look like as my best self. It just gives me something to aspire to. And it also gives me that sort of belief that it's possible. So yeah, that's really, really important to me. And it has been transformational in my own experience.
If I was to think back on my time at school or within education, I can recall some of the lessons which I felt were really successful for me or that I really enjoyed. And I kind of made a note of some patterns that I found. And these seemed to come around interest in the subject to start with, knowing that the teacher had a knowledge or a passion for the subject themselves, but I didn't expect them to know everything. There was a humour involved, and there was almost a kindness that was being shown as well, amongst other things. So, touching on the interest part of that, I had a genuine interest in all of those subjects that I had those patterns found within them. French we can kind of ignore, because the reason I enjoyed that was because I fancied my French teacher and I was a hormonal teenager at the time. So that's not something that we want to promote as part of these learning environments, I'm sure. But particularly for children who may be part of a group music session, or let's face it, are asked to attend by their parents, maybe not of their own interest. What can we do to help those children enjoy their experience as much as possible?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's the reality of our teaching, isn't it? Because we come to this role because we are absolutely inspired and motivated and interested by all of the music and the art and everything, and we will invariably be teaching people who are just there because they have to be. Just coming back to the things that you found motivating in your learning, they're very similar to some of these knowledge emotions, which is these four emotions that are considered to stimulate learning, and they are interest is one of them, and surprise is the other one. Really, really interesting. Confusion is also one of them, and awe is the other one. And so the idea behind these are that if we can include or create opportunities for these to be experienced in our lessons, then we can stimulate learning. Now, you sort of particularly hit home there on the interest one. And I think we all have our different ways of creating interest, don't we? I mean, I think where we can, adapting repertoire or using repertoire that meets with what the students like. One of the things that I do quite often is create a sort of context for the music. I found in my own learning that a little bit of knowledge can spark much more interest in a topic. So, if I little bit of knowledge in an area, then I will naturally be sort of prompted to develop more or to find more. So for me, this is creating stories for my students, around the music. It could be something about the composer or what the music might be about or their lives or anything that could be a sort of hook. Equally, it could be, a pattern, a harmonic progression or something else like that. I had a really sort of going off the topic a little bit. I had a student learning a grade 4 piece of music. And I said to her, "Do you know what my favorite part of this piece is?" And she said to me, "I bet it's that bit there." And I was like, how cool is that? This sort of relationship and this knowledge that she knew what was meaningful to me. And it sort of just strikes up a conversation. So just taking time to build those relationships also.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about those pillars? Like, I'd be interested to know how we can create elements of surprise and awe and that sort of thing as well. So how would you explain that for us to implement?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the surprise is sort of seen as something that kind of jolts you a little bit, something that's unexpected in the learning. So this can be your teacher kind of doing something a little bit stupid, maybe a bit of a crazy demonstration. It can be using something in a different way. So I've got like a box full of teaching, I don't know, props, we could call it. And we have specific ways of using them, but occasionally, we'll just toss a ball around, or, just something a little bit playful and unexpected in the lesson. So another way of creating surprise that I would use in my lessons, I'm a pianist, not a singing teacher. But one of the sort of fundamental principles around playing the piano is that if you play with some sort of sense of motion and playing from a point of moving into the piano rather than tensing your muscles to create a sound, then you're going to create a much rounder, resonant, beautiful tone. And so one of the ways that, we can support this or demonstrate it is I would, sing a note of music, and I would sing it, tightening my throat. This will probably bring pain to your listeners, forcing my vocal cords, and I would, push the sound out and create a really unpleasant tone through that tense, sort of area. And then I would sing it with, breath control and create a beautiful sound. Now, in a singing lesson, this probably wouldn't be a surprise at all, but in a piano lesson, for the students to suddenly start using their voice in this way and creating those correlations between muscles that are working out of tension and ones that are working from a sense of sort of movement can be quite surprising and quite interesting. And of course, having your piano teacher sing to you in a, and create a horrible sound can also be a little bit surprising. So, these sorts of things can be interesting. And along the sort of surprising element, I think using different ways, different demonstrations in lessons are also useful. My younger students love it when I make mistakes in playing their pieces. And, why shouldn't we? Because it gives them a chance to kind of feel a little bit proud of their knowledge. So that's another way that we can just create a slightly more relaxed learning environment. Mistakes are part of life. It's something that we can learn from. And it's a little surprise to the students. Confusion, I think, is an interesting one, isn't it? Because we tend to think that confusion is not a positive sort of experience to be learning from. And I think that it's definitely on a scale, in my experience. Confusion, for it to be effective, needs to be held in relation to some sense of self-efficacy. The student needs to believe that they are going to be able to work through that confusion for it to be possible. And so if we see that a student is confused, we can actually ask them to go, oh, you look a little bit confused. That's all right. That's part of learning. What do you think you can do here to get a deeper understanding, or to, kind of peel away those layers of confusion? And again, you're starting to get them to think through the processes that they might be working through. And then awe is an interesting thing in itself, because awe is something that humans most often experience when they're in nature and when they're engaging with music. So, I think we're sort of predestined to have a lot of awe in our lessons. And I think that's what can make them nourishing. I think what undermines that, though, is if, as teachers, we're always trying to, correct the student, and this note was wrong and that rhythm was wrong and this technique didn't work and that intonation there wasn't great. So how can we bring those moments of awe? And I think it's easier with technology these days. Can, watch an opera singer, couldn't they? Or, teachers demonstrating, I think, is an opportunity for students to just kind of go, wow. And I think that if we are also willing to kind of be vulnerable with our students and show them the path, that we went through, the learning path up to that point where we were able to give that sort of awe-inspiring demonstration, then that makes it even more meaningful, because you've kind of traced a track for them. So yeah, some ideas there.
Going back to the interest idea as well, something that I find can be quite useful is when you first meet a student, is asking what else they're actually interested in, so that can be referred to or referenced when you're learning something new in this skill. So if we are somebody who's interested in cooking, for example, we can use analogies that are more related to cooking or artistry or whatever that might be, and it can kind of pull that interest into our lesson.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's an excellent example. Yeah, thank you. I think it kind of brings me back to this idea that, the learning environment is also about how we develop this relationship with our students and how we get to know each other. And yeah, that's a great way of doing it.
Speaking of the knowledge that I found was one of my pulls from my learning, it was my English literature and language lessons at school that I loved the most. And also on my degree, it was musical theatre in context classes, which were my absolute favourite, which is kind of weird. As a performer, I'd expect the practical lessons to be top of the list, but it wasn't. It was the contextual classes, which were like a 3-hour long lecture on a Friday. But it was because these teachers were obviously passionate and deeply knowledgeable about the topic and were presenting it in lots of different ways. So it just made me want to ask about us as teachers and how we learn. And when it comes to our own CPD as teachers, how we can best support our learning so that we can bring that into the classroom.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So when you're talking about CPD there in relation to knowledge, are you talking about sort of that developing our core knowledge in, whatever the specialism is?
Yeah, I think so. And like doing more reading and taking courses and classes so that we can continue our skill set build.
I mean, it is vital, isn't it? And I think certainly over the period of my career, professional development for teachers who are maybe, private or peripatetic or self-employed performing arts teachers has just come on in leaps and bounds, which I think is fabulous, because as teachers, we're just giving and giving the whole time, and we need this nourishment, don't we, for ourselves? And, this is actually a conversation that I was having not long ago with some of my adult students and also piano teachers. How are you going to sustain yourself so that you can continue to grow, but also have, a lot to offer students? And I think the answer is actually individual. It's separate to everyone. I can tell you, I love audiobooks. I listen to them when I'm chopping vegetables and boring things like that, hanging up the laundry. And so that's a really easy way for me to kind of develop knowledge in specific areas. I mean, I think podcasts are great also, aren't they? Just kind of listening to other people and taking ideas. I think this is a really fundamental part of what we can offer each other as communities of practice is, sharing ideas, knowing that they will be adapted and personalized to suit that person and, their values and their aims for their students. So, and of course, there are lots and lots of more formal ways that we can undertake professional development. Having our own lessons, I think, is a really, really useful thing to do. As you know, I teach on this PGCert at Guildhall, and that provides professional development in pedagogy skills, which lots of teachers, who are teaching performing arts don't necessarily have as a separate degree or qualification. So, yeah.
I think what I'm learning is that the changes that we're making or the transformations that we're making in the room with the student don't have to be this profound moment or a massive thing that you spent loads of hours preparing to do. It can actually be the small things that make the biggest change. And also one thing I feel we have to manage all the time is the impact of our own difficulties and our own moods and frustrations, and how we can make sure we have a hold on those so they don't infiltrate and damage the environment that we're creating. So what would you say on that? Have you ever found yourself in a really bad mood and needing to, I don't know, change the way you teach that day?
I mean, we're all human, aren't we? So yes, I think that happens. I think, first of all, just to acknowledge the first thing that you said there, which is that I agree. It's the sum of those small things. I think it's pitching up for our students time and time again, being on their side, having belief in them. And also I find really important to be a sort of mirror for them to look in. I think so often in the performing arts, we're always looking forward, the next challenge, the next piece, the next performance, whatever it is. And actually, sometimes just for us to sit and say to our students, you know what, I'm just thinking back to how we were working 6 weeks ago, and look how far you've come on since then. And also just, creating the space for them to repeatedly just have small incremental bits of growth and development. And then you linked that to how we might pitch up in lessons when we're having a bad day. And, for me, it's going to obviously change for everyone depending on the context that they're working in. But I find a lot of value in just owning that with students and just saying, in an age appropriate way, maybe, oh, I'm feeling a little bit tired today. What could we do to wake me up? And, maybe I need to do some star jumps or something like that. And maybe there's an element of surprise there. And, maybe we can take those sorts of approaches. I think students read teachers very, very well. And I think if we are going to try and bluff, then we need to be quite skilled in how we carry that out. Of course, there's also the element of managing our own boundaries. And I think this is where, our values and what we want to put in place for our students' learning can guide us and, just kind of help us sort of clear out the negative things or whatever it is and focus on the student.
My history teacher had a great sense of humour, and even though he taught with authority, he had this way of bringing us up to meet him at his level. We had some brief exchanges on this topic when we first arranged to come together today. And something you said was, for us to get really useful, i.e. honest answers from our students, they need to feel safe and heard and valued. And as human beings, are those feelings kind of universal? And if not, how do we make sure that the person in front of us feels safe, heard and valued? So the ways in which they do feel those things, are they going to differ from person to person? And if so, how do we find out how that student is going to feel those things in our lesson?
And I think this is a really, really important question, because the degree of vulnerability that the student will be able to show with us is actually the degree of adaptation and intervention we can provide and support them with in their learning. So I think there's a few sort of key points around that. Everybody's going to need something different. And it comes back to this idea that you had earlier, really just getting to know the student, watching them, seeing what makes them tick, as well as also asking them. So in terms of creating that safe space for students, I think they need to be able to share their ideas and share their thoughts, and for those to be listened to and heard to by the teacher. So, we could say to our students, as a very sort of low-level example, what do you think will be a useful practice strategy for this part of the piece? And then they could give us an answer, and we could go, crumbs, I really don't think that's going to work really well, or we might be thinking, crumbs, I really don't think that's going to work very well. But we might want to say, great, okay, give it a try. How do you see it working? Let's go, go with that for this week and see how you come back. And so that student has been heard and validated, and we have to sort of sometimes change our mind in order to create that space for the student to say what they need to say. And if we can do it in those sorts of really low-level cases, another game that I play with my students, even my really young ones, sort of 6-year-olds, I'll say to them, well, that's quite a tricky bar, isn't it? You've got this going on in one hand and this in another hand. I wonder, how many times do you think you're going to have to do it for your fingers to start to feel confident? And lots of them look at me, they're like, well, I don't know. I'm like, it's not serious, take a guess. And they go, 3 times. Okay, great, let's see. And they'll do it 3 times. And, they'll kind of, after 2 times, they'll be like, oh, I can already do it. Or they'll be I'm going to need more than 3 times. But we're just starting to show them that they can be wrong and they can learn from that. And so lots of these little experiences, like we were talking about earlier, add up to the big stuff. So when we do need to ask them the important questions or something that maybe requires a little bit more sense of, exposure or something from themselves, they already have that trust with us and they already feel that their voice is valued in that space and that you're there, seeing them as their best selves.
I have like a very strange question, which is, do you practice this or do you find yourself doing this in like your social life? Because as we're chatting now, I actually really feel like you're doing this with me. I really feel like you're listening to what I'm saying or asking, because there's a sense of you kind of repeating part of the question that I asked or acknowledging the question that I've asked in a particular way. Like, is that something that you just find? Do your friends say, "Oh, I need to speak to Roberta because she's a great listener"?
Oh, Alexa, do you know what? You're very perceptive. I wasn't even aware I was doing it, but I am trained as a coach. And so there is this sort of place that you go into when you're listening to people, and you're listening on all levels, and you're listening to body language and facial expressions and what's not being said as much as what is being said. So yeah, maybe you're doing such a good job at making me comfortable talking to you, but I'm like in that listening space where I'm also really comfortable. But yeah, I think it's something that we can do for each other as humans that is really valuable. So there's an excellent book, I think it's called The Thinking Space. It's by Nancy Klein. I can look it up for you. But yeah, she talks all about thinking environments. And it's such a lovely sort of concept whereby the quality that we bring to our listening can improve the quality of the other person's thinking. And I love that idea.
Oh, wow. Yeah. If a singer has arrived to our session then from a previous situation, whether that's a friendship breakdown or a tricky class, and they seem upset, how will we need to adapt our session in order for their optimal learning to occur? Because we learn best when we feel safe, as we've said, and also when we're happy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we can ask them that question. That would be the sort of top tip on that one. And obviously, we might need to support them in their answer. Like, you don't seem really happy today. Would you like us to just get on with our piano lesson, or would you like to do something else first? Shall we do a warm up or play a game or draw a picture, for a younger student? And I think giving them that control in the lesson time and acknowledging where they're at is really useful and can change. It also, change the sort of however they're feeling or however they've arrived at the lesson. But it also allows them to bring their whole selves into that lesson space and not to feel that they have to leave something behind at the door. And that's really important to me, because I don't want my students to feel like they have to be someone they're not to access my learning. I want them to be who they are, and for us to work with that. And you're talking about your learning experiences, and we've all had our own learning experiences, and I know that some lessons I felt that I've had to somehow leave parts of me behind in order to be acceptable in that space, and that's not something I ever want to do to a student. Yes, there might be ways of working together that are important. So I'm not going to let a student bash my piano, and I'm not going to let them put their feet on it or anything like that. But that's just a sort of ground rules for us to work together. But yeah, they need to bring who they are for the space.
And not to be totally cynical, but what if there's a student who might be, hoping that we do something else, that they don't have to reveal that they didn't practice or they haven't bought their rep or something, but they're kind of not using that as a way out. But yeah, how do we read that?
I know. And it is going to happen, isn't it? I think we're all going to have our own ways of dealing with that. In my in my setup, how I work, one of the things that's important to me is that I'm there for the student. So if they need me to repeat a lesson or, go over some different practice strategies or alter my teaching approaches, then I'm going to do that. And, if there's some reason that they haven't got what they need or they're not prepared for the lesson, I would like to explore that with them and find out what I can do to better help them. And this has changed, when I started teaching, I was like, this is your practice, you go do your practice. And I don't know if it's that I've softened over the years or that I've just maybe seen the advantage of giving the student more autonomy, but it's certainly a lot more successful how I work now. And it's a hell of a lot less stressful because, if they don't do their practice in my first year of teaching, I'd be like, well, what have I done wrong? How am I going to make them practice? Do I need to speak to the parents? And I would take all of this onto myself. And now if they don't do their practice, I'm like, okay, something was obviously not working out for you there. What can we do? It sort of, again, it just opens this dialogue and gives me information that I can then use.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point. I've totally been there as well and been thinking that I'm crap because I haven't had the influence to help there. But yeah, I totally get that. In episode 169 of the Full Voice podcast titled Happy Hormones for Learning with Dr. Ginevra Williams, she says words that we use are really, really crucial. And we know on one extreme that if a child is really frightened or really anxious, they're not going to learn very well. If there's cortisol washing around the body, adrenaline washing around, the brain has become hijacked by that and you won't learn constructively. She also goes on to say how we could potentially reframe threatening phrases like, if you don't get these grades, you won't get into a good university. So 2, let's have fun learning this stuff. And whatever grades you get is where you're at this moment. And we'll be really happy with that. And if you've worked hard, we'll be really proud of you. So what are your thoughts on those things?
Yeah, I mean, definitely 100% agree with that, and being really careful about the language that we choose. And even now, I'll catch myself using a turn of phrase and I'm like, oh, that's a little bit a sort of deficit model, something negative. And just recognizing that comes from maybe my educational experiences and trying to reframe that. And, the whole concept of growth mindset language is also coming up for me in what you're talking about here. I think there's also something else, which is that who is setting what success looks like for each individual student, and to what degree can we adapt to their view of success. I try not to set my students' agenda. I try to hear from them what their agenda is and where they want to go. Obviously, not everybody knows, and younger students will need much, much more support and scaffolding in that area. But if I have a general idea of what success looks like for them, then working towards that is much easier. And it sort of takes away that need to say things like, you're not going to do well if you don't practice, because they're already aware of where they are and where they want to get to.
How do you make that work in a space like at Guildhall, where I assume there's more of an academic route, or there's assessments and things along the way? How much autonomy do you therefore give those students, or is it exactly the same, doesn't matter what environment you're in?
Yeah, so my work at Guildhall is, you're right, very much academic, and very much it's a postgraduate course, and it's for teachers who are already teaching, and it's in the art of pedagogy, teaching skills and stuff like that. So they are very much taking, theories and looking at different models of teaching and learning and things like that, and then understanding that in their own practice. And of course, in that sense, they've got assignments that they need to fulfill and assessment criteria that they are going to be marked against. But it's the creating space for their voice and for their interpretation of the materials. And this is what's really crucial, I think, for those students, because they didn't come there to be told how to teach. I think they came there to develop something that's going to be really exciting and unique for them in their practice. And that's one of the ways that we could sort of balance their voice and their expertise in their areas, because we're teaching across disciplines. So yes, as tutors, we might have the expertise in pedagogical knowledge, but how that translates, to a sound technician, to a ballet dancer, to a drama teacher is going to be different. So again, it's kind of like valuing who they are and what expertise they bring.
Yeah.
And I think that works with younger students also, because they might not have a lot of expertise, but they certainly know what they like and what they don't like, and who they are and what's important to them in their lives. And if we've got some space for that, then I think that's a really important part of the learning environment.
In terms of giving an instruction and using the language that we have to do that, how can we best provide an exercise that is concise and understandable without confusing someone in the environment?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think this is where we come back to what we were talking about actually at Italia Conti, isn't it? This idea that there's 3 different modes that we can be in when we're teaching, and that each mode has an advantage. So the first mode is connected to a very sort of transmission model of teaching, and it's very efficient, and it tells the student what they need to know, and it's sort of job done. The second mode is that we are creating experiences for the student to learn and uncover knowledge for themselves. It takes a little bit longer, but the learning is deeper. And the third mode is where we're actually aligning ourselves with the student and looking at a problem together. And that can lead anywhere. It can take longer, but it's also really empowering for the student. And the general idea behind these teaching alignments, they're called, is that using a variety of them gives the student the best opportunities of engagement. So if you need to tell the student something, then I would say we just tell it to them, don't we? We say, look, this is my knowledge, this is my experience, this is what I think you should do. You can always ask them how that lands. I think they're going to be able to do it. I think is really important, because they're not going to do it if they don't understand or they don't think they can.
The idea of learning styles, that has been something that has infiltrated the educational realm, I guess, with we must have, some people are audible learners, some people are kinesthetic. I think over the years it seems to have been more poo-pooed. So is there such thing as a preferred learning style, or are we really trying to make sure that we can cover all bases?
It's a great question, isn't it? And I will talk from sort of my experience in this one. So, there's this whole new area developing called neuroeducational research, and it is all about, what the scientists can discover about the brain and learning, and what the practitioners and teachers know about what happens in class. And between these two bodies that have very different spheres of expertise and ways of talking and understanding, we get these ideas that kind of don't quite translate. And these are now called neuromyths. So yeah, you're right. They've sort of been poo-pooed scientifically. It's an oversimplification of what is happening, and not really anywhere near a biologically realistic description of what's going on in the brain. However, there's still something to be said for multiple ways of experiencing something. If we teach something in one way, then that's one opportunity to learn it. If we teach something with a sort of visual connection, with something that's more tactile, and with something that's more auditory, then they've learnt it 3 times. And they've learnt it, I sort of feel like, from 3 different perspectives, or they've experienced it in 3 different ways. So learning something 3 times against learning something 1 time is always going to be more engaging, isn't it? And potentially more interesting. So I think, it's a useful model or it can be a useful model in our lesson plans. And so instead of just going, well, this is how I think about notation, and they must think of it this way, just encouraging ourselves to find different ways of maybe teaching something. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting point. And I think other neuromyths that have come about are sort of drinking water during the day is not proven to have any biological, neurological enhancement to our learning, which seems strange, actually, doesn't it? It's like the thing that we all need to thrive on. But what does drinking water involve? Maybe it involves a whole class of children getting up, stretching their legs, moving to a different part of the room, having a sip, just sort of refreshing themselves physically and mentally, and coming back down and coming back to their seats. So do you see what I mean? There can be
like different benefits. So a way that we could maybe do that in the music room, could it be something like, listen to this example, try that out on yourself and see if we can recreate the same sort of results. Okay, that's your practice. Write down what your intentions are. And then when you're actually practicing it, you're reading back the instruction. I guess then there we're including lots of different ways for that to be engaged with.
Yeah, I think so. And I think in listening to that example, you can listen to it with your eyes shut. So, I don't know, I listen differently when my eyes are shut somehow. Or you can listen to it and follow a score. Or maybe you could listen to it and move. And, just having these different experiences, I think it can be really interesting. And it's also unique, isn't it? It's not something that they'll be doing in their other lesson.
Yeah, so true. When it comes to feedback, and this I know was the topic that you came and did an amazing presentation. I really enjoyed it at Atelier Conti. So thank you so much for that. Which was, when is it optimal to give feedback, and how do we give feedback in that environment that we've created?
It's a fundamental part of teaching, isn't it? And, we're always giving feedback. But I think also if we stop and listen, then our students can also give a chance to experience this giving feedback. And so for me in my teaching, I'm very interested in the feedback that my students give themselves, because it gives me a really clear idea about at what level they're thinking and working. And I think it's really important that the feedback we offer our students is not so far above or so far below where they're actually working that it sort of becomes meaningless to them. So, some of the things that I've found work really well for me is after a student has finished playing, or in your case, singing, just asking them, how did you feel that went? What did you, and I often say, what did you like about it first? Because I think they need to be really clear on that. And again, it comes back to that sort of strengths-based approach. And what would you like to change about it? And once I've heard their thoughts, then I'd say, okay, I've got some ideas. I hear you when you're talking about this area. I'd love to suggest something about this. And would you like to hear that suggestion, or would you like to work on what you've pointed out? And just giving them that choice. Often the older students will say, I'd like to hear what you've got to say. And then we'll try and cover both. But the other thing that I also do around the feedback is we will take a sort of mini little process, a little bit of time out of the lesson and say, right, out of all of these things, what I've said, what you've said, what are we going to work on for today? And that little moment of sort of contracting, almost a little mini segment of the session, gives them that chance to tell me what they want to be learning. And again, it just makes it more impactful.
When I first started teaching, I fell into the hole of overpraising, which I guess is better than, making people feel like crap. But I went through a phase of, which is great for people's confidence, but I also had to kind of just rein it in a little bit, because I was just really bringing them up when maybe it wasn't as honest as where things needed to be focused in on. So how would you advise teachers who are new or who struggle with that, like I have, of overpraising, but on the other side of that, giving constructive feedback, which has positives, but also targets what we really need to focus on for benefit?
Really, really good question, I think, and a trap that lots of us have definitely fallen into. So the thing about praise is that what's really important is to link it to something that the student is actually doing. So, instead of just going, that was superb, you could say, you could still say that was superb, but then say, you've made so much improvement on your intonation since I last heard this piece. And then it's actually telling the student what they can do to repeat that superbness in the future, rather than just being this sort of empty thing that they don't really feel they've got any control over, and can actually be quite anxiety inducing if you think about it. That was superb. It's like, but how am I ever going to do it again? And then there was a second part to that. And I think that one of the sort of primary bits of advice on this is to praise effort rather than to praise the outcome, because I've seen a lot of students where the outcome is maybe not where we might want it to be, but the effort is there and the intention is there. And actually taking a moment to just recognize that effort is going to set the scene for them to then be able to hear better what to do with it from there. So, I've seen students, doing something like, with this really confused look on their face and really peering at the score like they haven't seen it, and trying to work out the notes, and then looking down on and you can go, and it's like wrong in every way, isn't it? That's not the technique, and it's not how you read music or anything like that. But I can say to them, I can see you really, really tried to understand that part. Is it still challenging for you? What do you think we can do that's going to make it easier? Do we need to write something on the music? Can we, find an exercise or something like that? But I've still given them that initial bit of recognition for their intention, even if it wasn't successful.
Can we talk about like the physical space that a student comes into? Because a lot of us might not have too much say in how the space is actually set up, especially in institutions, for example. But how does the physical space have an impact on the learning? And do you have any advice for how we can set that up, even when we don't have much say in what goes on there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think also just to acknowledge that the physical space that we might be teaching in, the student might be occupying in different roles or in different ways. And that can also make a difference to their behavior or how they might enter that space. So, yeah, I think everybody's going to feel different, but we've all got a bag of teaching resources, haven't we? And I think that having something that maybe sets that space apart as a space that we're in, together with the relationship that we build and the ways that we communicate and create space for the student, is where the difference is. So, one of the things that the sort of games that I play with students is I was saying earlier, this box of resources, and it's just toys, really. And, I'll just say to them, go and choose something that you think is going to help your learning today. And just going up to the box, and they're thinking, ooh, what's going to help me? And they look in the box and they choose something completely random, but it just sort of changes how they experience that space. And it's just something a little bit different.
There's that famous saying, isn't there, that you can do anything if you put your mind to it. So having said that, if we were in the most optimal environment, everything was hunky-dory, is it possible for all of us to learn anything?
It's a brilliant question, isn't it? And it's, I think, the original nature nurture debate in a sort of teaching context. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit. Have you read this book, Grit, by Angela Duckworth?
No, I haven't.
It's excellent. It's such a great, accessible read. And I'll tell you what she says. So she says that talent times effort equals skill. And so what that means is that talent might kickstart the process and it might sort of make it a little bit easier, but you still need to put in that effort if you want to achieve the skill. And then she says that skill times effort makes achievement. And then she turns around and she says, so effort counts twice. And I love that, because I think it sort of combines those two elements. It doesn't take away from the fact that as different people, we're all going to be slightly better at different things, but you need 2 times the amount of effort, according to her, in order to reach that point of achievement.
I don't think any amount of effort that I put into being a physicist would ever be enough.
Well, I'm with you on that one. You know, it's that initial spark for me there is just not there in the same way it is with, you know, music or teaching and learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I suppose if someone really wanted to, they could put in twice the amount of effort, but it's still going to be a challenge. And
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Guildhall PGCert that you were part of? And if any of our listeners are interested, how do they check that out?
That would be amazing. Thank you. Yeah. So this course actually, I think was, you know, you were talking to me about, you asked me earlier about what changed for me, or what was the most effective learning environment for me. And it was while I was studying on this course that I experienced that. So it's a very dear one to my heart, if I can put it that way. And what's special about it is it's interdisciplinary. So it's a sort of collection of practitioners across the performing arts who absolutely are dedicated to their teaching practices and are looking to improve their students' sort of experiences by developing their teaching skills. If people want to know more about it, then we've got a website which I will share with you, and we've got open evenings coming up early on next year also, so they can always come and attend one of those. But what I love about this course is that it doesn't say to you, do this in your teaching, partly because actually that's not going to be effective. Just like we know with our students, we can say do this, but doesn't mean they're going to go and do it. But it also creates space for the practitioners to develop what is going to be most effective in their practices. So yes, you're learning about theories, but they're all fascinating. They're all deeply connected with performing arts pedagogy, and you can interpret them in your own ways. You can create your own models and your own processes. So it's really tapping into that creative element that I think so many of us in the performing arts thrive on.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope that our paths cross again.
Yes, so do I. Thank you so much, Alexa. It's been lovely talking to you.